My name is Vanessa Timmer, and I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called One Earth, and we're focused on thriving well justly within our ecological footprints. And I'm here zooming in from Vancouver, Canada, where we are learning a lot about how to do that well from the First Nations. This is actually Vancouver, Canada sits on the unceded First Nations lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And as Renee was speaking about, there's a lot of practices from the First Nations that we can definitely learn from, including deep listening and attunement. And our work with One Earth is in partnership with another initiative called Hot or Cool. And together we run an initiative called the Beacon for Sustainable Living. And this is, as Renee was mentioning, a KR Foundation supported project. And this is, you can see it here, the Beacon for Sustainable Living. The support of KR has not only supported us with this initiative, but also with connecting us with Renee, with Elizabeth, with the Project Inside Out team. And we were on a Zoom call with Renee and the KR Foundation grantees when Renee welcomed people to join as a partner program. So we applied because we could see the value. If you can go to the next slide, Pedro, the Beacon is an initiative about supporting those leading the way on sustainable everyday living by identifying creative strategies and overlooked approaches to living well within our, within our ecological footprints. And the key part is that we've really brought together people who are working on sustainable everyday living, including those bringing our lives within 1.5 degrees or one planet living. And by bringing that group together, we found what Renee spoke about, that many of these these leaders were doing a lot in thinking about this in a systemic way, coming from a values and story building approach and looking at it from the behavioral change and incentives perspective. And we could really see the value of bringing in the emotional and experiential in order to support all of us as individuals and also as leaders in this community to move this work forward. And so if you go to the next slide, Pedro, these are the areas that we're focused in on for the Beacon for Sustainable Living. We're looking at how do we rethink the idea of reduce? How can we take moments of life transition, including the COVID crisis now, but also when people grow up, get married, retire, immigrate to a new place? How can we bring sustainable living practices and support people in those moments, on cities and sustainable living, and on imagining what sustainable living futures could look like? And if you go to the next slide, Pedro, basically these were the participants who signed up when we gave them the opportunity to try out the Project Inside Out approach. And we decided that we would pick up from where Green Faith had really led the charge and focus on air travel, because many of these people, just like Fletcher, traveled for their work in the past. And we knew this was a part of that kind of internal tension that Fletcher was speaking to. So we also noticed that people were coming with a lot of that anxiety about the future, about change, and often pushing advocacy or cheerleading out to others. So we felt like this had a lot of promise in thinking differently about how change happens and giving people the opportunity to take a deep breath and just settle into themselves and figure out how they're coming at or feeling into how they're coming at their work and how they can also support others. So it was really about the individuals from each of these organizations, but also about equipping them to guide in their own work. In order to do this work well, Max Serpa, who's a One Earth associate, was a perfect person because he's always come at this sustainability issue from the health of the person as well as the health of the society at large and how they're connected. He has a background in somatic psychology and sociology, in faith traditions, data analysis, and community organizational consultations. So he was really the perfect person to bring the Project Inside Out work into the context of the Beacon for Sustainable Living with these colleagues, and to actually be the host and facilitator of those meetings. I'll let him speak about the process, but I just want to say one last thing. that Project Inside Out is very open to organizations like ourselves or initiatives adapting what they've put forward and really bringing it forward with our own kind of special sauce. So it was really a pleasure to work with Project Inside Out to be able to kind of attune to what we needed in our context with the tools that we had. Over to you, Max.
Thanks, Vanessa. So great to be here. Great to hear from you, Fletcher and Renee. And we certainly had our own dose of special sauce. Pedro, if you could go to the next slide, please. So what you see here is the rough schedule that we had. So there were 4 main sections of what we did. We had a pre-survey, the actual air travel dialogues, a post-survey, and then the grounding sessions. The air travel dialogues was the bulk of what we did, so item number 2 there. We had 35 folks from our community come to attend those, and a number of our staff from the One Earth and Beacon teams. So the purpose of the pre-survey was basically just to get people familiar with the content that we are going to jump into, kind of a priming, if you will, and also to get some basic information about where people were at. So we were able to include that pre-survey information in the air travel dialogues. The air travel dialogues I'm going to speak to in a second for the next slide. The post-survey that we did was just a check-in to see what people's experience was like. And then we were able to share that forward a little bit in the grounding session, which I will also have a unique slide for. Pedro, could you move to the next, please? So here you see a general overview of what we did and what resulted. So beyond the items, what we did of creating a supportive environment, inviting deep individual reflection, and exploring flight data, one of the pieces that I pursued, because our community was one often interested in methodology and the intellectual framework of things, is that I provided just a basic overview of what Project Inside Out's methodology is about. So that's similar to what Renee went over this morning. I covered the 4 A's as well, which Renee touched on too. And then beyond that, I just continued on to really use the facilitative and the guiding approach that Project Inside Out encourages. So the results of that overall were safe exploration, insights, changed approaches, and setting of future intentions. So we really followed grounding and faith lead there with using air travel as a topic. And so the intentions that people set were around how they could decrease their air travel in the future. So one important thing that came up was unanswered systemic questions. The design of the workshops that we ran were really about doing individual exploration, which is great. But a big question that came up for our community is like, okay, so when we do this individual exploration, then how do we compare that or work with that in relation to the facts out there that, say, for instance, people who really benefit from air travel are the people who don't suffer its detriments as much. So I'm thinking of like rising tides due to climate change, and how it's usually people who live on coastlines, often in countries that are not as affluent, who are really affected by that, where it's people in affluent countries that are really benefiting from air travel. So I think for us, the next evolution of where we can take this is really biting into that intersection of the personal and engaging the systemic at the same time. Pedro, next slide, please. So for the grounding session, the intention for that PIO had was to basically provide people an opportunity to check in with how their intention was going and what their experience has been like since they had the initial air travel dialogues. So we did that, and then the bit of our special sauce that we added was to also speak further about Project Inside Out's approach. We had this grounding session just in September, and so I wanted to give people a bit of a preamble to what Project Inside Out would be talking about in their summit happening today and yesterday. So we did a basic exercise to help people understand the difference between writing and guiding. So during the check-in, it's worthy to note that it was, the format of it was relatively open. And so people were able to, of course, check in with themselves and then take the conversation where they wanted. And one of the things that I found with that is that people did speak about their own personal experience, and then they also moved towards talking about the political and having it be a little bit of an intellectual conversation. So that was something worthy to note, that for our community, there was really energy for both the personal and the systemic. So with that, Renee, I think I'll pass it back to you. That's a good summary of our approach.